Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Denis Dunicic. Subscribe to our channel. Now let's get right into our main story today, which is the United Nations 2021 Conference on Climate Change, or the COP26 as it's shortened to. So basically what's happening is this Sunday, the follow-up to the Paris Climate Accords in 2015 is going to occur in Glasgow, Scotland, United Kingdom. Now, the goal of this conference is primarily to introduce 3 new agenda items to reduce carbon emissions and general pollution emissions in the world. Now, many people who are attending this conference, including the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, have made climate change seem like it's this do or die issue, saying that the survivability of humanity is at stake, that if we cannot solve this issue, humanity will die off, and that our future is completely ruined and over. Now, the reality is most scientists will actually tell you that's not the case. Now, that's not to say that climate change isn't bad. It is a very, very real issue that is occurring and causing a lot of real world problems that we can tangibly see and experience today. All of us, all over the world, can recognize and see climate change on not a daily basis, but in our year-to-year lives. By now, you probably should have noticed the difference if you're old enough. Now, it's not the end of the world, but the reality is that climate change is causing extreme weather events. It's causing water levels to rise. Now, before I go into the water level rising, I want to comment on the extreme weather events. Now, things such as floods, wildfires, droughts, massive tropical storms, which have been experienced in Europe, in the United States, in Africa, in the Middle East, all over the world, have been causing at least $320 billion in economic loss. Now, this is infrastructural loss, economic damages, rebuilding things after natural disasters. This is a real issue that we are experiencing, and it is costing us not just a lot of money, but a lot of human lives. Climate change also causes migration. Keep in mind that the war in Syria, which has been one of modern history's darkest and, in terms of human life, costliest conflicts, was partially caused by climate change, with droughts making farmers who lived in rural parts of Syria have to move into central and larger metropolitan cities. And differences between these rural people and the city people, which were ethnic, religious, etc., caused social uprising. Now, climate change did not cause the war in Syria. That's going way too far, but it definitely contributed to it. This is a real issue. And going back to rising water levels. Water levels are increasing all over the world. And right now, since the Industrial Revolution and the Industrial Age, global temperatures have increased by 1.1 degrees Celsius, which is about 2.7 degrees for our American friends. And it's estimated that if global temperatures increase to 2 degrees Celsius, smaller island nations like the Marshall Islands will be completely wiped out. This will cost a lot of human lives, and it will cause and create major refugee and migration crises, which no one likes. Refugees don't want to live in someone else's home or nation, and a lot of countries don't want to accept refugees. That's just the political reality we live in today. This is a real and very tangible and very visible issue that is extremely serious. Not as serious as some people are making it to be, but it is something that has to be solved. And it's a global one. It's not an issue that one country or two countries or a trading bloc like the EU or ASEAN or the African Union can solve on their own. This problem requires cooperation from every single nation on Earth. And that's problematic. Countries like to cooperate when their interests align. And keep in mind, the purpose of every country is to work in its own national interest, to increase its influence in the world, to increase its economy, to increase its power. That's the purpose of every single nation, and any good leader is going to act on that. Now, sometimes cooperation is really easy. For example, when United States interests align with British interests, it's very easy to cooperate. When many European countries want to have easier economic trade, travel, etc., things like the European Union are created, and the trading bloc becomes more powerful and European nations collectively become more influential. That is when cooperation is easy to introduce. However, sometimes interests collide. For one nation to achieve its own interest and another nation to achieve its own interest, one nation loses out or another nation loses out. And that's called a zero-sum game. There can only be one winner. But the reality is if we don't all cooperate on this issue, we're all going to be fucking losers. And the biggest thing and the biggest problem that's occurring right now is creating cooperation between these nations. Now, before I get into that, I want to mention what the three main goals of this conference are. The three main goals are, number one, for every signing party, and it's more than 200 countries, virtually almost every country in the world is a part of this conference and wants to participate in some way. Even North Korea has sent a delegation to attend. North Korea, the Hermit Kingdom, wants to partake in solving climate change. It wants to be active on this issue. And that shows how serious the problem is. The number one thing on the agenda is for every signatory state to impose regulations on itself to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030. Or at the very least, to decrease its emissions to make their emissions less than what they were between the periods of 2010 to 2020. Number two on the agenda is for wealthier and more developed nations to provide either poorer or developing economies $100 billion a year to help them in this transition. And we're going to go into that point later. Number two on the agenda is extremely important, the $100 billion for developing nations. This is actually the source of major conflict between countries, and we will go into that later, just keep it in mind. Number three on the agenda is for $50 billion a year to be allotted towards research and helping humanity adapt to climate change. Now, even if every country on Earth agrees to go out today, right now, and solve climate change, we're not going to do it. We cannot stop, we cannot prevent, we cannot change climate change with the technology we have today. Maybe one day it will be possible to reverse the effects we've created on the planet, but most likely we cannot stop this issue. All we can do and hope to do is mitigate it. We have to invest money into adapting to the changes that are occurring, such as how to transfer people from island countries when they become flooded, or how to at least make life livable in nations that will have rising water levels, how to be able for countries and cities to have the infrastructures to be able to take major extreme natural disasters such as wildfires, droughts, and tropical storms. And this 50 billion is way too little. Much more should be invested in this. And this is my opinion, okay? This is not an opinion of some expert. It's not the opinion of some scientist. It's the opinion of me, Dennis Dunich. So it's probably not the best opinion, but it's my opinion. I'm going to say it anyways, goddammit. We should, instead of focusing on completely mitigating or changing climate change, focus on adapting to it. It's too late to change it. We need to learn as humans how to adapt and evolve and live in a different environment, which will eventually change. Maybe not in my lifetime, but it will in the lifetime of my children and future generations. Now, finally, we go back to what is the biggest roadblock to this conference. The reality is, despite how intense this issue is, despite how severe this issue is, and I mentioned it's not the end of the world, but it is probably globally speaking, collectively, the largest issue facing humanity today. There are other conflicts and humanitarian crises occurring in the world, but those crises are affecting specific regions. This affects all of us. But despite that, this conference is probably not going to be very productive. Xi Jinping, the chairman of the Communist Party of China and the de facto president, supreme leader, ruler, and dictator, he is a dictator, of China, will not be attending, at least in person. He may attend virtually. And even if he doesn't attend in person and attends virtually, that means nothing. Keep in mind, what's filmed and the speeches that are given and the negotiations that are on screen for the media to see mean nothing. Those are just a play show. Real deals and real bargains are made behind the scenes, during the pauses for coffee, during the lunches, during the dinners, during the parties. That's when people make deals. That's when negotiation happens, off camera. And if there's not a Chinese delegation there to negotiate, pretty simply, nothing is going to be done. And China is a very important country here. China is still a developing economy. It's a very powerful economy, a very developed economy, but it's still developing specifically in its western regions. And China has become essentially the world's second most influential superpower to the United States. China intends to keep developing, to surpass the United States. And China wants to have and finish its own industrial revolution before it goes green. China is the world's largest producer of emissions by far. In fact, China is such a large producer of emissions that if the agreed upon goal of this summit is to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, China is such a large producer of emissions that even if every other country on earth reduced their emissions by 45%, this includes other large producers of emissions like the United States, India, Russia, Pakistan, even if they reduce their emissions by 45%, the world would only collectively reduce its emissions by 30%. That is how large of a producer and causer of climate change China is. But to be fair to China, and to understand the economic situation of reducing emissions. Reducing emissions isn't simply saying, oh, let's all go hug some trees and build the wind panels and the solar panels to have green energy. It's complicated. It costs a lot of money to do these things. You have to take old fossil fuel producing plants, you have to take coal mines, you have to take natural gas burning production facilities and completely change them with green and newer renewable energy. And it's not just getting rid of a coal plant and replacing with solar panels or a wind farm. You have to change the infrastructure of every city that is being powered by these plants. You have to change the pipelines, the generators, what's generating this power. It costs a lot of money, time, and energy. It's not simply going out and hugging some fucking trees. This is an issue that causes economic stagnation. Industrialization and pollution is bad for the environment, but it's good for a nation's economy. And keep in mind, America and Western Europe are wealthy today because of their own industrial revolutions. America is the world's wealthiest country and one of the greatest nations that God has ever seen on earth because it had its industrial revolution, because it had its coal-powered railways, because it had its steamboats, because of pollution. That's what made America great. The United Kingdom became wealthy because of post-Victorian and Victorian industrialization. Germany became great because of that guy. Yeah, that guy. Industrializing Germany. That's what made these countries wealthy today. And it's unfair in a sense, at least in China's perspective, and not just in China's perspective, but in other developing countries such as India and Pakistan and countries that are developing their economies. It's unfair to them that the United States, the West, were allowed to have their industrial revolutions, but now the world says they can't have theirs. And to be fair to the Western countries, industrial revolutions occurred in the middle of the 20th century. We did not know about climate change at the time. Scientists didn't really know about climate change until around the 1970s. Scientific consensus wasn't made on it until around the 1990s. It wasn't shown to the public until about the 2000s, late 1990s. And still today, significant portions of every country's population refuse to accept that it even exists, which is just fantastic. You know, there's people that believe the earth is flat too. Anyways, the reality is these Western nations who developed with industrialization did not know at the time, and they just did what was in their interest to develop their economy. Now, China and other developing nations know that their development and their industrialization is causing pollution and is causing a global crisis. But the reality is they have to look out for the interests of their people. And sure, making an agreement where wealthier nations give or contribute some money to these countries to help them on their, or compensate them for decreasing this industrialization is definitely going to be a positive that's going to assist in making a deal. But the reality is you have to understand the political situation, more specifically between the United States and China. Now, even if every other country on earth agrees today to go and reduce their emissions, if the entire European Union, African Union, India, Pakistan, every other country on earth says, you know what, let's reduce our emissions, let's all sit down and decrease it by 45%, we're still going to have a global crisis unless the United States and China can agree to work together, put their other differences aside, and work together on this issue. But that probably isn't going to happen. Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Abraham Lincoln, if he was president today, would not give money to China to compensate them to become more green, and would want to impose heavier restrictions on their economy. Keep in mind, China's economic growth is against American interests. If China surpasses America economically, it can eventually surpass America politically and militarily. And the United States is no longer the world's hegemon. And that's important for American interests. And China wants to become the world's hegemon, which is fair. Every country should strive for this. And this roadblock, this zero-sum game, is going to be the reason why I personally believe this climate change conference occurring in Glasgow, Scotland, and beginning this Sunday, that's going to last for 2 weeks, is not going to produce anything meaningful. It's also why I don't believe that any really long-term solution can be found to this problem. And instead, what nations should be focusing on is collectively investing and providing resources and financing to find out how humans, to help the science and research, and find out how we as a global population, humanity, Homo sapiens, can adapt to climate change and live in a new environment. Maybe that sounds dark, and maybe that sounds out there, but I genuinely think that's the only solution to this problem. But that's what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments section. Let's have a nice, respectable debate. Let's stick to facts. I don't want to hear that the earth is flat or God wouldn't cause climate change. Try and stay respectful. Let's be productive. Thanks for tuning in this week. I'll see you next time.